Okay, I'm starting to record, but at this point, whenever you're ready to introduce Sascha, you go ahead whenever you think is best.
Sure. So I just want to say hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. My name is Fareed. Isabel and I are hosting this event as representatives of the Undergraduate Environmental Union at Duke. Currently, we're a subset of the Duke student government, and our mission is really just to promote collaboration and create a network between the environmental institutions on campus and beyond. Today, we welcome Sascha Boden, who is the project manager at the Energy and Climate Protection Department of Deutsche Umwelthilfe, I want to say. Please correct my pronunciation.
You could say Environmental Action Germany, actually.
Yep,
That's the
Environmental Action Germany in Berlin. I thought I'd give it a try. At his work, he campaigns against new fossil infrastructure such as LNG terminals and pipelines. He also works together with affected communities at the proposed sites of the projects, both within Germany and other countries. Today, he will be giving a presentation on the role of German NGOs in environmental justice. We want to thank Mr. Boden for offering his time today. And without further ado, take it away, Mr. Boden. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fareed. Thanks so much for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk today. And let me maybe start off by saying, as already mentioned, I'm working at Environmental Action Germany or Deutsche Umwelthilfe. And before I kind of go into the details of what we do, I kind of want to give a broad overview so that we're all on the same page. Let me first share my presentation for that matter. So before I talk about what we're actually doing in Germany and abroad and how this kind of intertwines with environmental justice, I would like the opportunity to talk a bit about what environmental justice actually means, because even though a lot of people may be aware of what it means, this term is kind of used interchangeably with climate justice sometimes. And I think in the context of this presentation, in the context of what we're specifically doing, we kind of have to make it clear what these things actually do mean. So when it comes to environmental justice, real quick, this is actually a movement that comes from the labor movement, from the civil rights movement. And it grew out of a response to the system of environmental racism, where communities of color and low-income communities have been and continue to be disproportionately exposed to and negatively impacted by hazardous pollution and industrial practices. So think of how low-income households are usually located near waste sites, near industrial sites, near refineries. So they are already impacted by things like emissions, things like noise, things like pollution. And this has been the case, for example, for a lot of Black communities who are low income, who have been low income. And this movement kind of emphasizes this bottom-up organizing and the centering the voices of those most impacted. So what is important to understand is that this movement is ongoing, obviously. It's been started, it's been going for quite a while, but it's far from being over, obviously. And it can be kind of combined, or it can be kind of defined as realized when all people can realize their highest potential without interruption by environmental racism or inequity. And you can read further here. I'm not going to read out all of it. But what I want to say with this, it's quite broad, and there's a lot of aspects going into this. And it's kind of important to say that this is where it comes from, but it's also intertwining with other things, other aspects of the justice movement. For example, climate justice. So if you kind of want to if we have environmental justice on the one hand, there's climate justice on the other side, which would be a bit more specific, if you will. So climate justice can actually be one aspect of environmental justice. So think about things like the environmental impact that low-income households or minorities are exposed to, that this environmental impact is more and more influenced by climate change. So for example, in the upper right corner, you see a picture from Hurricane Katrina in the US, where you had exactly this problem, that people who were already exposed to a lot of environmental threats were living in areas that only provided poor housing and that were more exposed to risks like floodings, like storms and such. So climate justice is kind of more narrow, and it is a term and a movement that acknowledges that climate change can have differing social, economic, public health, and other adverse impacts on underprivileged populations. So it's kind of the concept that those least contributing to climate change will be affected most, for example, through changes of their environment, which would be environmental justice again. So they're intertwined, they're interlinked, but they're not necessarily the same, and it's important to understand where that comes from. Also, yeah, thanks Isabel for posting that chat. I forgot that in the beginning. If anyone has questions along the way that concern the understanding of what I'm saying, please feel free to just shout them in, so we don't have to do a whole presentation where I just talk. If you can't get up, or if you have any questions along the way, just let me know, please. Yeah, so these are kind of two things, and they're both important when it comes to our work. And I want to give a few more examples of what climate justice means, because it's way more global than, for example, environmental justice, which can be defined more narrowly. One of the things that are constantly coming up, or that constantly comes up when it comes to climate justice, is the global south, global north disparity, right? So global south is disproportionately affected by food insecurity and by nutrient deficiency. This has been the case before the impacts of climate change got as worse as they are now, but this exacerbates, of course, food insecurity and nutrient deficiency. So if you look at the 10 most food insecure countries in the world, they generate less than 0.08% of the total global CO2 emissions, which is huge, huge in terms of inequality, obviously. Another example would be a gender disbalance, right? So women are disproportionately affected by climate crisis, for example, because they are more likely to live in poverty than men, but they also have less access to basic human rights, like the ability to move freely. And they already face systemic violence that can escalate during periods of instability. So again, a lot of women are working on the fields in a lot of developing countries, a lot of third world countries. And these things are, again, interlinked with climate change and climate catastrophe. A few more other short examples that you can see here. So obviously it affects minorities. It also affects indigenous communities. So indigenous communities are usually living in a closer relationship to their environment. That makes them especially sensitive to the impacts of climate change. But they're also exposed to the same, lower living conditions that are also being faced by other groups, minority groups, or by other groups of marginalized peoples. Last example is the LGBTQ community, because a lot of LGBTQ people are more vulnerable to, for example, homelessness because of the social stigma. Then they have to leave their homes often, and this can obviously lead to the situation where they're more exposed to environmental disasters like hurricanes or heavy floods and such. So there's a lot of things going in there, but I will highlight a few of those things that are particularly important for our work a bit later along the way. For now, this is just some information I wanted to give you so that we're all kind of on the same page. So how does Germany come into the whole scene here? What's the role of Germany as a country of the global north, as a developed country? For this, you have to go back in time a bit. And if we look at the CO2 emissions that you can see here on the graph, it kind of becomes clear that if you look over the historical emissions, there's only a few countries who actually caused most of the emissions up to date. So there's China, there's India, there's Russia, but there's also the EU. So here you can see the 28 member states of the European Union, but you can also see Europe down here as a whole continent. And the US is by now still the biggest emitter of emissions if you talk about cumulative emissions. But what becomes clear is, if you look at the role of Germany, is that Germany actually is the fourth largest emitter of CO2 emissions in terms of historical emissions. We're still quite high when it comes to the emissions, but we're not place 4 anymore, but obviously we want to be less. So this is an issue also in international climate policy, because obviously countries like India and China say, okay, you kind of caused the mess, and they're not wrong, right? Because when we talk about climate justice, we talk about those who contributed the most to the problem. They should kind of, tackle the climate crisis first. So this is important to kind of understand why we as Germans, as German community, as German NGO community, we kind of have to, or we kind of play an important and special role in these things as well. Which brings me to us. A few really boring stats, probably. I just want to go through that quickly so that you can kind of have an image of what we're actually doing. So we are an organization that has been founded in 1975. We're quite old. And we have over 100 people working for us right now. We have national offices in Berlin, where I'm based, but also in other cities of Germany. And we have really a wide variety of areas that we work in. For example, municipal environmental protection, where they're doing a lot about environmental justice in a city, in the city surrounding, but also nature conservation. And the area I'm working in is the Energy and Climate Protection Department. Within that department, we again do a lot of stuff, especially now with you know, a lot of things going on in Germany in terms of coal phase out. We want to phase out coal by 2038. Again, quite late actually. We have a lot of new things that are coming up. For example, hydrogen rollout, or the role of the gas grid infrastructure and emissions that come from that. I don't want to really talk about these things so much in detail. I want to kind of explain environmental justice and how it intertwines with our work with one example, which would be the stopping of new fossil infrastructure. So this includes LNG terminals, but this also includes a new pipeline called Nord Stream 2, which is to be built between Russia and here. It's almost finished. And within that, I want to focus on the LNG terminals because it's just a good example of how you know, those kind of value chains and process chains work throughout the globe, and how this has to do with environmental justice as well. For that to happen, I want to kind of talk a bit about what liquefied natural gas actually is, because I'm not sure if everybody's on the same page as well. So LNG, or liquefied natural gas, is basically just natural gas, but it's been compressed by a factor of 600, so that becomes a liquid. And so you can transport it, for example, via huge tankers around the world. And upon arrival, it would be regasified and it's fed back into the local gas grid. This is important because in the energy world, it plays a huge role right now. First of all, because coal is getting less and less significant, or there's a lot of public pressure and people kind of understood that we have to move away from coal. But on the other hand, LNG as opposed to pipeline gas is interesting because you can just, you know, change the direction of those vessels. So if the LNG price drops or some buyer wants to pay less for the LNG, it just goes somewhere else. So from an economic perspective, it's really good. From a climate perspective, it's equally as bad because natural gas is also a fossil fuel and we have to phase it out soon, sooner or later. Better sooner than later, obviously. And this graph on the upper right side that you can see here, it's going to be important in a sec because it kind of talks about the whole process. And I want to illustrate how environmental justice plays a part in each of those process steps. So what you can see here is a map of the German coast. So north is Denmark, west is Netherlands, east is Poland. And this is one of our campaigns that are actually happening right now. So we have 3 LNG terminals that are planned on the German coast. You can see them on the left. On the right side, you also see Lubmin. That would be the part where the Nord Stream 2 pipeline comes in, but let's put that aside for a second. And let me talk about these terminals a bit. So these terminals are a problem in terms of climate justice, but they're also a huge problem in terms of environmental justice. That's not only the case for Germany, but that's especially the case for the countries where these fuels might come from. In order to understand that, I want to go back with you a bit. I want to go back through the process chain because these import terminals obviously are here. And again, I'm sorry, this is obviously in German, but import terminal is the same in German than in English, so that's fine. But I want to go back to the first step, which would be the extraction. Now, in this example, we said fracking here, and this is for a reason. And the reason is that the US is one of the biggest producers of LNG. But with those LNG terminals that are being planned on the German coast, there is a really strong and clear correlation between why these are being built and who wants those to be built. And we see that the LNG exports to Europe have already soared in the last 2.5 years by about 600%. And we have strong evidence or strong indicators to tell us that these liquefied natural gas terminals will mostly or likely receive gas from the US, among others. And this gas will likely be from fracked wells. So that's why we use that here. In order to understand that, then we have to go back to the extraction method of fracking. And I think some of you may already be familiar with this, obviously, but I want to kind of give a small update between the difference of fracked gas and conventional gas, if you want to call it that. So I brought you a small graph, and what you see on the left side here is just a normal oil and gas well, which just drills into the ground vertically. It reaches a pocket of gas or oil, and it pinches it, and then you can transport and you can recover the gas. With this well on the right side, it's different because this is a fracking well, which is deeper, but it also goes first vertically and then it goes kind of horizontally through gas-rich formations, which are mostly shale formations, at least in the US. This technology has not been profitable until maybe 2010, which is why the gas industry in a lot of countries, but especially in the US, declined until then. But when it became profitable to do this technique because it was more expensive, then you had this fracking boom that has been going on for the US, but also for other countries around the world. And that's, from an environmental justice perspective, a huge problem, because if you look at how this looks, you see pictures like this. So this is the Permian Shale, which is also located in the US, over Texas, but also New Mexico. And what you can see are a lot of wells. So these are all small fracked wells, probably a few hundred in this picture. And with this fracking technology, a lot of environmental problems come. And here we kind of reconnect to environmental justice as well, because these fracked wells are usually located in rural areas in the US. And well, there's kind of some main issues with that. One of the issues that is not so much local, but more global is the issue of methane emissions, which I don't want to talk so much in detail. I just want to mention that methane is a really powerful greenhouse gas, and natural gas is mostly methane, 75 to 99% usually. And you have a problem with this because in a lot of parts throughout the supply chain, from the well to the transport to the consumption, there's leaks of methane because infrastructure usually leaks. And especially in the US, you have a lot of abandoned wells. About 2 of the 3 million abandoned wells in the US are currently leaking methane. So this is a problem from a global climate justice perspective because nobody's really aware of these emissions so much, but there's more and more media coverage. The problem also is that you do not see methane with your eye. You have to use special camera equipment to make it visible. So this is a picture from a New York Times article that I think almost won the Pulitzer Prize, not sure, but it's a really good, news article that kind of covers this problem for the US, but obviously that's also problematic for other regions of the world, for example, Russia, where a lot of German gas comes from, but we do not have any data there. That's our issue, we're kind of blind. The more local environmental impacts are also manifold. One of them is earthquakes. So because for fracking, what you have to do is you have to drill the hole, but then you have to use fracking liquid, which is mostly water, but also chemicals, and you pressure that into the air, and the gas is kind of contained in small stone structures, and they have to be cracked open. When this happens, that's a lot of pressure, and this can lead to earthquakes. And this is a known and common problem, both in the US, but also in other places, for example, in Europe, in the Netherlands, in Great Britain, where this is being done, that, for example, there's a lot of cracks in houses and infrastructure in general there. But also the water is containing chemicals, as I said. Part of this fracking water stays in the ground permanently. You cannot retrieve all of it. Yet at the same time, you have a problem that deposit water sometimes surfaces unintentionally. And this deposit water then contains the chemicals that have been used, but it also contains radioactive materials. So you have to deal with this chemical water, which is a problem in and by itself. A lot of times, if there's no strong regulation in place, this water is just dumped somewhere. It's put somewhere in an artificial lake, so to say, and then it can reach the ground surface water as well. And this obviously is really problematic for the people who are living there, because these are usually also communities who are already poor and do not have the same access to infrastructure, to health systems than people in other areas. And I will cut to that in a second. The last thing I want to mention is point out is how much water is actually being used. So in the US, for example, you need about 5 million gallons of water per well, and you have about 670,000 active fracking wells in the US right now, so about 2/3. So this is a massive amount of drinking water, which is a problem in obviously areas that are more dry, have a dry climate. But also in other areas, the other problems that come with this just stay, obviously. Back to environmental justice, as said, frac wells are mostly located in poor and rural communities. Obviously, that has on the one hand something to do with the fact that you have to look for where the gas actually is in order to drill it. But on the other hand, it's kind of convenient because there's usually less resistance from people if there's not so many people involved in these processes, and there's less people living there, and you have more room for this. And actually, people have been doing some studies on that as well. I think I actually found one study by Duke University on this, and they looked on the Marcellus Shale, Pennsylvania region, and they found a strong correlation between active fracking wells and poverty levels. And they also found chemicals in the drinking water. They found radioactive radon, sulfur dioxide, all near those natural gas sites. And this kind of feeds into what I said before about the threats of fracking. And you can also see this really visibly. So one of the problems that the local population has in a lot of places is that they can literally lit their tap water. They can just put it on fire because methane contaminates groundwater aquifers through the drilling process. And you know, these are mostly people who still have a big problem with this, and these are things that are not really being dealt with in a lot of places, both I would assume in the US, but also in other places, obviously. And yeah, so this is one of the examples how this is kind of intertwined, because what we're doing is we're trying to influence the direct decision makings in Germany in order for those terminals not to be built. But we also work with communities abroad. And this is the beginning of the supply chain. So before we actually can have any influence, there's already environmental problems occurring with this. Which brings us back to our little process graph. So the second step would be the liquefaction, or Verflüssigung in German. So as you have import terminals, you also have export terminals, obviously, and this is where liquefaction usually happens on site before it's being shipped out. This is how it looks. This is an example from New Brunswick in Canada, but they're all kind of similar. So you have those huge tankers. You have those storage tanks where they keep the gas, store the gas. And you can see already this is kind of quite a big infrastructure, right? It has to be built somewhere. Usually these are areas that are either quite quite pristine, or it could also be the place, and I'm gonna or the case, and I'm gonna talk about this a bit later, that there's already a lot of industrial development going on, which is, you know, again, good from an industry perspective, but it's bad for the people who are living there because they're already exposed to certain threats. And this would be one threat that would come on top, because, well, liquefied natural gas is not unproblematic in the sense that it can explode, especially if it's pressurized. There have been some accidents in the last couple of years where there were accidents in LNG terminals or close to LNG terminals. And that's also something to consider. So is this infrastructure worth it? Maybe it's from an economic point of view, but especially when it comes to climate change, especially with all we know, on top of all the climate crisis stuff, this also happens to local population. The fracking happens to local population, and so on and so forth. So in order to give you a better idea how this looks in practice, in real life, this is a map of the LNG export site in Rio Grande Valley, so also in the US, ports of Brownsville in Texas. And here they're actually planning 3 LNG terminals that you can see on the map. And there are different things that are happening here as well. So you have, on the one hand, nature protection zones, but you also have fishery going on and other small scale economic activity. If such an LNG terminal is built, and if such an LNG terminal would undergo, a disaster or any kind of accident, that would obviously involve and impact the communities who are living there. The problem again here is that this kind of runs along pre-existing lines of injustice and inequalities. So for this area specifically, 93% of those impacted in these areas are of Hispanic or Latin descent. And they're also often part of communities who are one of the poorest cities in the country. So the more than 35% of those people living in poverty already, now this LNG terminal comes, or the LNG terminals are being planned, which kind of adds to the environmental injustice that these people are already experiencing. And at the same time, you kind of have to say, because there's often an argument about jobs, those jobs are usually not going to the local population because they are specialist jobs, but also there's not so many jobs involved in an LNG terminal once its construction has been finalized. So this particular region in Rio Grande Valley is also already struggling with major health disparities, and it's an indigenous sites of importance, including burial grounds. So there's a lot of stuff going on that, you know, companies do not really consider, and in a lot of cases they do not have to consider them. But of course, especially if we talk about, you know, indigenous sites of importance, this is something that cannot really valued high enough for those indigenous communities, but they often do not have a say in those decisions, which is a fundamental part of environmental injustice again. So, and I mentioned that before, the last part, projects would significantly impact the local fishing, shrimping, and ecotourism industries as well. So let me give you a second example, because this is not intertwined with our work, because we're actually not working with this community now. We have established some contact, but I have another example for you that is a bit more directly connected to our work, which is the planned Goldboro LNG terminal in Nova Scotia in Canada on the East Coast. So Canada obviously is a big resource extractor, is a big producer of oil and gas, especially tar sands, but also fracking and also conventional oil and gas drilling, obviously. And they have not been able to do anything here, also because there's a local, local organization, or there's actually a few local organizations who kind of oppose the construction of this terminal due to various reasons. And one reason I want to talk about, which is it's an issue that is particular to Canada as well, is that you have a lot of negative impacts on Indigenous women, and this comes, and this is kind of intertwined with the LNG terminal, obviously, as well, right? So the LNG gas, or the gas for this LNG terminal, is claimed to come only from Canada, and the investor only claims that it's only coming from so-called conventional wells, so no fracking. Be that as it may, with the construction of fossil infrastructure, there's always workings involved. There's always someone who has to kind of build this infrastructure, maintain this infrastructure. And the problem here is, especially in Canada, that those construction areas where new fossil infrastructure is being built, they employ usually a lot of personnel, and a lot of times this personnel is exclusively men. And in Canada and in other areas, you call them man camps, and these man camps have been linked to the disappearing and the death of Indigenous women in Canada. So you have a big problem there when it comes to environmental justice. Again, parts of the Indigenous community who are already disadvantaged have to struggle with this as well. And Goldboro would add to this as well in Canada, both at the site, but also further inland. I also have to mention that we think that the investor cannot provide gas that is not fracked, or cannot only provide gas that is not fracked for this terminal. But this is kind of where we come in as German Environmental Action. So we are working with the activists at the ground where this is going to be, where this is supposed to happen, where this is supposed to be constructed. But what is interesting here is that there's involvement from the German state as well. So the German state is financing a lot of fossil infrastructure all over the world. In this particular case, we have the situation that the investor of the terminal, which is Paradise Energy, claims that they have a loan guarantee by a state-owned bank of Germany, so-called KfW Bank. And they say that they have that, but they're also trying to get a loan from the Canadian government to kind of move forward with their plans. So the financial stability of this project is already on really shaky grounds, which makes you think, why would you plan an LNG terminal if you can't really profit from it? Apparently, it's all kind of dependent on loan guarantees. It's all kind of dependent on the help of third major parties. The company claims that the terminal will not transport fracked gas, but this is indefensible because we know that they actually, as a matter of fact, have to transport gas from the US to Canada and then to the LNG terminal. And this will most likely be fracked gas. Also, where we kind of see a lever as a German NGO is that one German company called Uniper, which is a big gas trading and consumption company in Germany, has actually made a deal with Paradise to use the LNG that is coming in the next couple of years import it to either Germany or to import it somewhere else. Where that would be the case, they haven't really specified, but that's how German entities are involved in this project. So as I said, we're working together with the local activists there, but we rely on their expertise and knowledge. So what we can do is, for example, we can write open letters to the government. We can, conduct online information events, invite members of parliament, invite members of the German Bundestag, and we can kind of pressure and create public pressure on the topic. But there's a multitude of considerations going on in Canada itself, and we cannot speak to this. So this is where, partner organizations come in that know more about these things, because especially for Goldboro, we have the situation where the indigenous community is also involved in other ways. So apparently for the building of the infrastructure of the LNG terminals, there's going to be a big camp again. But in this case, indigenous communities are supposed to kind of get a piece of the cake, if you will, and kind of construct this. So this is a way too much of a sensitive issue for us to really be involved. So we kind of rely on our partners to kind of know what the right decision is here and to navigate through this. So this should be enough for the part of the export terminals. Obviously, the import terminals face similar problems here, and I've showed you the map of Germany before, where you saw those 3 import terminals that are being planned, and I want to concentrate on one, and I want to kind of illustrate what's going on in terms of environmental justice here as well. So again, sorry, this is a German map, but I'll explain really shortly, briefly. So what you can see is the LNG terminal in Stade, which is actually the biggest one of the 3 that are proposed and being planned, with about 12 billion cubic meters of import capacity a year. And this red line here, this is the site where the LNG terminal is supposed to be. To the north, you have a so-called Oxidfabrik, which is just a chemical plant. On the southern area, you also have a chemical plant, actually a whole park of chemical plants. And what this is a former nuclear power plant, which is now being used to store nuclear waste, basically, until Germany kind of figures out what to do with this. And also on the other side of the river, you have a huge nature conservation area. And what you can see here is Bützle, which is a small region, small community, right next to all of these fossil infrastructure and all of these refineries and all of these industrial parks. Excuse me. So again, right? So this is already an area that is low income, that is not really strong in terms of infrastructure. The people who are living here do not necessarily profit from the infrastructure that is being built here, yet they have to deal with things like emissions and noise as well. And this is really cool. Well, not cool, but interesting example of how German politics tries to influence these things. So for example, without getting too technical, they try to kind of change the official plan that says what this area can be used for. So right now you can't build another LNG terminal here because it's considered too risky, among other things, because in the south you have this, nuclear waste disposal. So they kind of made a small they kind of made a small thing. The investors and some of the local politicians try to change this plan, try to change what can be on this ground, and they kind of forgot in their documents that there's a nuclear waste site. So they just kind of eradicated that from their plans, which is obviously one point where we kind of can jump in as an environmental organization and say, hey, this is not okay what you're doing, and we don't know where you got these plans from, but this is not accurate at all. So again, what our role is here is, first and foremost, we have to use our resources, our capacities to assist people on the ground, to assist the communities there. And as is the case with Goldboro, we are also working with communities in Stade, but also in the other 2 cities that are the subject of proposed LNG terminals. And I just actually came out of a meeting 2 hours ago with one of the groups where we talked about the next steps, what we can do to kind of raise awareness to politicians and to kind of update each other on what's going on. And this is kind of our main role. So how can we use our resources as effectively as possible in order to help communities both here in Germany, but also abroad? And so again, here, the environmental and climate justice bubble is kind of intertwined. So through stopping German import terminals, we also lower the probability of projects being realized elsewhere. So for example, through the withdrawal of German partners, through the withdrawal of loan guarantees, we can kind of make sure that projects like LNG will fail, and therefore there's less demand for gas, or there's at least less incentive for people to kind of use that gas, extract that gas somewhere else. Yeah, and apart from that, yeah, maybe that is something important to add to kind of have a positive outlook here as well, is that the 3 LNG terminals that we are working on, all of them have been seriously delayed. There has been no final investment decision for any of them, even though the investors said again and again they're going to do that really soon, but it's always being delayed. One of the reasons is that we kind of put in legal opinions that say that even if you get a final investment decision, it would actually not be possible to permit those terminals on those grounds in all 3 cases, in all 3 cities, due to, among other things, the environmental hazard that these terminals pose, because there's already nuclear waste sites, but also industrial areas, industrial and chemical infrastructure there. So this is one of our main things as well. We can kind of use our legal expertise to stop these projects if the law kind of gives us an opportunity to do so. And of course, we have also the lawsuits as last resort. So if those terminals are being proposed, if those terminals are actually permitted, we will go the way of suing them, because as said in the beginning, these terminals do not fit into our climate protection targets as well in Germany, especially because German climate protection targets are too low anyway, and they have to be raised. So in conclusion, environmental and climate justice connects to our work in a lot of ways. Some of them are less subtle than others. So first of all, of course, it connects within Germany because we have impacts on the local population that are kind of exacerbating environmental injustice and are exacerbated through climate change as well. But you also have the impacts outside of Germany, right? You have the resource extraction that I've mentioned in countries of origin, on local, often already disadvantaged population that have to deal with this on top of everything else. And I mean, it's not going to be better, right? So the climate crisis is just accelerating. So this all kind of comes onto everything else people have to deal with already. And last but not least, Germany's role as a historical big emitter and a developed, affluent global country of the North gives us a special responsibility to kind of influence these decisions, whether they're being made here or abroad. But that being said, and this is my last slide, that being said, we kind of have to reevaluate constantly what environmental justice and climate justice means for us and what our role is in this. So first of all, this is true for within our organization. So how do we make sure that environmental justice is actually lived? And how do we make sure that different voices are being heard? As a German NGO, we have the issue that we're not so far in terms of diversity, right? So we are quite good when it comes to gender balance, but the visibility of LGBTQ members is not that good. We do not have disabled people. We do not have people of color in our staff, which kind of, if you think about it, you are more effective as an environmental organization if you kind of have a multitude of voices that bring in complete different perspectives on these things. So this is something we kind of continuously have to work on. But also environmental justice and climate justice is intertwined with the affected communities that we work with abroad. So I have not had any example of the Global South in my presentation, but that's also something we've been doing because there's new fracking going on also in, for example, South Africa. And our role is here to putting them and their voices first, right? So we are kind of here to assist. We cannot slip into the role of, this new colonial actor that says, okay, we know how to do things right. We have to kind of rely on what they think is right and what they think is the best use of our time and effort for them. And yeah, as I said, continuous self-reflection and acknowledgement that a lot of damage has been done already is part of this as well. So the climate crisis is a reality. It's here, it's accelerating each day. And we kind of have to acknowledge this, that a lot of things are already lost due to the actions of the global north, especially. And yeah, do that make sure that the resources that we have are used as best as possible to protect those most affected by the consequences of our collective actions. Yeah, so that's so far it from me. If you have any questions or comments, you can always drop me a mail, or you can also call if you like in the German office. And you can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook, and receive our newsletter if you can speak German though. So on to the discussion. If there's any questions or comments or something I said wrong, please help me learn better as well. And thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much. I don't know if you want to stop sharing so that you can see everyone's, or whoever has their cameras on, the faces. Great. Fareed, do you want to start the discussion? Kind of lead in this.
Sure. So first of all, thank you so much, Sascha. That was amazing. I'm sure we all learned so much. I'd like to open the floor. If anyone has any questions, please ask away. Other than that, I think Isabel has some discussion questions that she can ask if no one else has questions. But yeah, anyone feel free to unmute and ask away.
Yeah, so if nobody has a question right off the bat, that's totally okay. Maybe some of our questions will get you guys thinking about your own questions as well. The first thing I'll say is that if people are able to turn their videos on, then that would be great, just so that we can kind of see each other's faces when we're interacting. But once again, we definitely understand if that's not possible. So yeah, the first question I had was, towards the end of the presentation, you talked about ensuring diversity and inclusion in like these German NGOs, specifically in the ones that you work with. And so I was just curious kind of how you guys do ensure that diversity is happening, and not just diversity of employees, but kind of up the leadership hierarchy, that all the way up, it remains diverse and people of all backgrounds remain included. I'm just wondering about the actual process.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Isabel. That's a really good point. So I've been working with DOH for a year now, and in December was kind of the first time when I actually heard about this. You know, I actually heard about internal processes of kind of trying to diversify and doing what you just said, you know, also employing diversity or kind of making sure diversity happens until, you know, the highest ranks, if you will. And I think we're still quite in the beginning of the process. We have a diversity roundtable, which is, again, in my opinion, too many, you know, people who identify as male and cis-abled, and we're still kind of in the process of figuring out the basics, I think, because the opinion, especially from the head offices, which is not Berlin, but it's Radolfzell, where DOH has been founded. They're kind of, as I said, an old organization, and they have a lot of staff that are not so much connected to diversity issues. And so for them, it's about things like, okay, if you put out an application form, and if you offer a job, you say, you know, we welcome applications from people of all backgrounds, independent of their gender, independent of their religion, and so on and so forth. But I think that there's still a few people who kind of stop there a bit. I think we have good intentions, but we definitely have to, you know, think about things like, can we be more visible on the website, and can we say, okay, this is why we especially like people of color, especially like people of from the LGBTQ community to join us, and this is why we think it's important. In terms of leadership, you're absolutely right, and I put out the slides not because I'm afraid of this, but because of time restrictions. We have 2 federal managing directors, both male, both white. We have one, how do you say that? Like deputy director, which is female. So this is something, it's a start, but still, and obviously, you know, we kind of try to make this visible, but the fact of the matter is, no matter how often you display our deputy director in social media, if you have two federal managing directors who are male, you kind of have to reflect on this and try to make it better, you know. But I would say we, you know, at least in Berlin, we kind of have we have a lot of input when it comes to diversity, but I think the process of turning that into action and making sure that it's actually being lived, we're only at the beginning of this, I'm afraid.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for explaining that.
That was a lot, I'm sorry.
No, I mean, it's an important thing to discuss, so it warrants the long explanation. So yeah, I'll wait another, maybe I'll pause here if anybody has any other questions. If not, I have one more question that I will ask. So I'll just pause for a second, see if anybody unmutes, or you guys can also, if you don't like want to unmute, then you can also send it in the chat. You can also send it privately to like Fareed or I, and we can read it out if you don't want your name to be shown. So yeah, I'll just pause for a second. Any questions from other people? And if there's no questions right now, then the next question I had was, you spent the majority of your presentation talking about the LNGs and the work in that realm, but you did have one slide towards the beginning where you kind of bullet pointed out other work that the organization does. And one of the ones that caught my eye was, you said counteracting silly transitions away from coal or something like that. And I was just wondering if you can talk briefly about what you mean by that, because I was intrigued and I'm sure other people were too.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thanks for raising that and commenting that. So yeah, so the bullet point was counteracting silly ideas in the context of the coal phase out. So what's happening right now in Germany is that, and I talked about this before briefly, we have made or put into law that we're going to phase out coal power by 2038, the latest, which is way too late. But that's what's happening right now, and that's a huge problem in it by itself. But what this leads to as well is that a lot of municipalities and a lot of cities are thinking about how they kind of transform away from coal. And unfortunately, the most obvious answer for them, at least, is natural gas. So they're trying to kind of do a switch from coal to gas, or maybe also to things like biomass, which comes with its own problems, especially if it's large-scale biomass. The question is, where does this come from? Another project of us, for example, deals with the fact that a power plant near Hamburg wants to import wood from Namibia to fire it into their power plant, which is kind of insanity as well. So what we're trying to do here is we kind of try to stop this in its tracks, right? We don't want any new gas-fired power plants that are not needed. We still need some of them for grid flexibility in the next 10 years, but there are so many new ones being planned, I think 260 or something like this, that it's just, you know, if you do this and if you consider things like methane emissions, there's no way to reach your climate targets that are, as I said, way too low anyway for Germany. So we're kind of trying to raise awareness. We're kind of trying to say, okay, what's the alternative here? Can you work with, more small scale power plants that maybe work with things like heat pumps, but also the possibility of hydrogen, even though that's a really tricky issue. So I don't want to get into that so much because most of the hydrogen that is available right now is still based on fossil fuels. But yeah, that's kind of like this. I put it in here as well because it's quite new. So a lot of municipalities are in the process of deciding this in the next couple of years. And yeah, we try to kind of get in right now and say, okay, don't do this. This is a bad idea. If you do it right now, you have to decommission this plant in the next 10 years, even though its life cycle is 30 to 50 years.
Yeah, that makes sense, and it makes sense to phrase it like that when you're kind of talking to them about it. So those are the questions I had. I think that Fareed might have had one. I'm not sure. I think so. So I can bounce it back to him. And then after he asks his question, if nobody has any more, I think that we'll wrap up.
Yeah, first, if anyone else has a question, please go ahead. Otherwise, I'll just ask, how does your organization feel about nuclear energy and that sector? I know you didn't really touch on it that much, and it's, but go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the question again. The answer is short. We do not think that it's any it cannot provide any solution to the climate crisis at all. So first of all, Germany is phasing out its last nuclear power reactors by 2022 or 2023. I'm not entirely sure yet. So this is kind of put into law already. And I know that there's a lot of talk about small scale reactors right now. I know that, for example, Russia has actually a vessel in the Siberian Sea that is on a ship that is a nuclear reactor, which, you know, is kind of weird when you think about it. But the problem is here that you have insanely huge costs on the one side. So if you consider all of the things that go into the search for a place where we can put that stuff for the next couple of million years, and the energy production and consumption that comes with it, but also the fact of the matter is that we have to decrease our global emissions by about 50% by 2030. And if you build nuclear power plants, these have, you know, planning cycles of decades. So even if you would start now, you would not solve the immediate problem. The immediate problem is to get down and get off of fossil fuels right now as fast as possible. And this especially includes natural gas, because natural gas contains methane, and methane is an extremely potent climate gas. So we are not really dealing with nuclear energy right now because it's not an issue at all anymore. We kind of passed that. But unfortunately, a lot of people are actually using this nuclear and coal phase out to ask for, not the exit, but the input or the introduction of more natural gas, which is also problematic from a climate change perspective.
Thanks so much. Yeah.
Great. So I think that if nobody has any questions, then we will wrap up and head off. So last call, any questions? No? Okay. So I'm going to stop the recording, and you guys will get an email from us with that recording. So if you want to circulate it around to your friends and family or your social media following, you're definitely welcome to do so. Thank you all for coming, and thank you so much, Sascha. This was very informative. So yeah, thank you so much for spending an hour with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
Awesome.